Adding fruit to your carnivore diet may appear harmless, but it's actually a massive mistake that can lead to some serious downsides. So in this video, I'll break down the 5 main problems with including fruit on a carnivore diet. What happens with many people on carnivore is they'll add fruit to their diet and they immediately feel better. But this can be easily explained. Fructose is a type of sugar that makes up roughly 30 to 50% of the total sugar that's in fruit. But fructose is metabolized very different to other carbohydrates. Regular carbohydrates are converted into glucose, which then goes into the bloodstream. However, with fructose, it is metabolized directly in the liver. Some of this fructose then turns into fat in the liver. Because of this, your body feels very fed. It thinks it has an abundance of energy, so temporarily you will feel better, as well as the fact that because it has such a pleasant and sweet taste, it releases a tremendous amount of a hormone known as dopamine. Dopamine is responsible for the feeling of motivation, pleasure, and reward. So when you're having fruit 3 to 4 times per day and you're constantly giving yourself these dopamine spikes, in the short term you will feel good. But here's the thing. Fruit's short-term satisfaction does not outweigh the long-term issues it can cause. The first problem with fruit is the defense chemicals themselves. Now, everyone on carnivore avoids vegetables for this very reason. We know that every plant contains a long list of toxins, so we don't have them. But fruit is also a plant. It's often claimed that fruit is the least defended part of a plant. And while this may be true, it definitely doesn't mean that fruit's good for you. For example, kiwi fruit contains oxalates, which bind with calcium and form calcium oxalate crystals. These are very inflammatory. In fact, 80% of all kidney stones are caused by these crystals. Bananas contain lectins, which bind to our cells and cause inflammation. So at least to some degree, the defense compounds in fruit will make it at least somewhat inflammatory. But it gets a lot worse. Now, if you were to pick a fruit from your garden, it may be true that it is less defended than a vegetable. However, when you're buying your fruits from a supermarket or your local fruit store, this is not the case. The thing with fruit is that it overripens very fast. And when it overripens, it goes bad. Nobody wants to eat it like that. So in order to counter this, fruit growers must pick their fruit before it ripens. This way, when it gets to the store, it's exactly how people want it. The only problem with this is unripe fruit contains significantly more defense compounds than ripened fruit. This is why if you have unripe tomatoes, they can literally kill you. Now, when fruit ripens off a tree, by the time it is ripe, it is significantly more defended than when it is allowed to ripen on the tree. So the fruit you have from your fruit store is a lot more defended than if you were to get fruit out in nature. But again, this is just the beginning. The next issue with consuming fruit on a carnivore diet is a switch in fuel source. On carnivore, we become something what is known as fat adapted. Essentially, this is how it works. For most people, their diets are heavy in carbohydrates, so they eat carbohydrates and that is their fuel source. But when they run out of carbohydrates, their body's not very effective at tapping into its own body fat because carbohydrates and your own body fat have very different structures. This is why the average person who has lots of carbs in their diet is very hungry all the time. They need to eat every 2 to 3 hours to top back up their energy levels. They can't tap into their own fat. But on carnivore, it's very different. When your diet is high in fat, so your primary fuel source comes from fats, when you've run out of the energy from the fats you've consumed, your body can then very easily tap into its own body fat for energy because your body fat and fat do have very similar structures. This right here is why so many people on carnivore report that their appetite decreases significantly. They never feel hungry, they forget about food. So what can happen when you add fruit back in is you lose this ability to not be hungry. You'll start to get hungry again frequently. This leads to energy fluctuations. Your energy is going to be bouncing up and down all day. Your mood's going to be up or down all day. Because you've now lost this ability to just run on your own body fat so efficiently, you're going to have to start eating more, which can then lead to weight gain. I've heard so many stories of people that were on carnivore for a long time, feeling amazing, they added a bit of fruit in, and all of a sudden, they're 30 pounds heavier. But this isn't just anecdote either. In this study here, they compared 2 groups of people. One was told to eat a very low carbohydrate diet. To this group, the word calorie was not mentioned. They didn't have to restrict what they ate at all. Their only requirement was to eat low carbohydrate foods. And the other group was told to eat a calorie restricted, low-fat diet. The low-carbohydrate group lost 8.5 kilos on average versus 4.8 kilograms on average in the calorie-restricted group. So the low-carbohydrate group lost significantly more weight, despite the fact that they weren't tracking calories or limiting portion sizes. But to make matters worse, for a lot of people, you'll also lose the ability to feel completely full and satiated. On carnivore, you have a massive steak and you're just good for hours. You don't want to eat anything else. you feel incredible. The reason for this is when you have a large meal like this, a hormone known as a leptin increases significantly. Now, leptin essentially is what says to your brain, hey, we're full, we can stop eating. But what happens when you consume carbohydrates, such as in fruit, is you get a large blood sugar spike. Now, this is very toxic, I'll talk about that soon. But to bring your blood sugar back down, another hormone known as insulin elevates. The problem with this is when insulin elevates, it actually blocks leptin. The greatest example you've probably experienced of this is you have a massive meal, you're absolutely stuffed, and then you have some sugary dessert. All of a sudden you've got that second stomach, you're hungry again. This is what happens when you consume carbohydrates. You block the leptin and you start to feel hungry. I actually noticed this personally. When I first started carnivore, the thought of adding fruit sounded very appealing, so I gave it a go. Instantly, I noticed I got a lot hungrier. Even the world's most famous neuroscientist, Andrew Huberman, has said the same thing about when he added fruit to his carnivore diet.
So I added in fruit, non-pasteurized cheese, and honey the way they do that. And sorry, Paul, for me, all it did was just send my appetite through the roof. I was just like gorging myself.
The human body runs best on fats. Our mitochondria, which is the part of our cells which produce our energy, they run a lot more efficiently on fats than they do carbohydrates. And being fat adapted is just a monumental life enhancer. I love the fact that I can just not eat all day and still feel incredible. Why would you want to lose that? But you know what the craziest part about fruit is? It's not real. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, has this bloke lost his mind? I've seen fruit many times in my life. I've touched it, I've felt it, I've looked at it. How on earth is fruit not real? This right here is a banana. This right here is a watermelon. This right here is an avocado. These things right here are man-made. I know it's crazy, but all the fruits and vegetables that we consume, they're not real, natural plants. We've made them. How this works is 12,000 years ago, we started agriculture, which essentially is just growing crops and farming. But because humans are so smart, we discovered something known as crossbreeding. How this works is they grow two similar plants close to each other. These plants would then cross-pollinate, and essentially you'd end up with a hybrid style plant. Through this process, we were able to create all of our fruits. A lot of people say, how on earth can fruit be bad for us? It tastes good and it's natural. Because it tastes good, this is our body's way of saying it wants it. But here's the thing, none of us know how natural fruit tastes. Natural fruit is not very sweet. It's often filled with seeds. The fruit we have nowadays is tens, if not hundreds of times sweeter than it is in nature. I personally have never tried natural fruit. I mean, I'm sure it'd be very hard to find. Maybe if you went really deep in some jungle, you might find fruit that hasn't been tampered with by humans, but because we've been around for a while, even that would be very hard to find. But if you bought me a banana and instead of it being sweet and juicy, it was full of seeds and was not sweet at all, I can't imagine that I'd enjoy the taste of it very much. But so what? Yes, we've tampered with it a bit, it's not in its natural form, but why is this a problem? If you were to make this argument, you'd actually have some credibility. If I was to say that fruit was bad for you purely because it's not natural, it would be an appeal to nature fallacy, and I'd be wrong. But here's the problem with fruit now. Because modern fruit, through this crossbreeding process, is so high in carbohydrates and therefore sugars, here's what happens when we eat it. A considerable amount of these carbohydrates break down into glucose, and we get a massive blood sugar spike. So a hormone known as insulin is released. The role of insulin is to bring our blood sugar back down. It does this by signaling to our cells to take in this glucose. Our cells then begin to take in this glucose through what is known as the GLUT4 transporters. But there's a problem. Too much glucose in a cell is very toxic for it. Our body already creates all the glucose it needs through a process known as gluconeogenesis. So these cells are already full with the fat or glucose they need. So a lot of this glucose is then trapped out. This becomes very problematic. The sugar in our blood starts sticking to things. This results in a process known as glycation, which is just a fancy way of saying glucose sticks to things such as our red blood cells and the other cells that surround it, which then leads to inflammation. You can actually get this checked very easily. Hemoglobin is a protein in red blood cells. A very simple blood test you can get done is called a hemoglobin A1C test. This will tell you exactly how much glycation you have going on, because it's a measurement of glycated hemoglobin in your blood over the past 2 to 3 months. This inflammation then leads to something known as AGEs, Advanced Glycation End Products, which again, this is just a fancy way of saying the inflammation caused by the glucose sticking to our cells results in this. You age faster, your joints become damaged, cognitive decline, cellular inflammation. Basically, it can lead to anything. Inflammation is the root cause of all human issues. But with fructose, it gets worse. Like we talked about earlier, fructose makes up 30 to 50% on average of the sugar in fruits. but fructose is actually a lot more reactive than glucose. Because of its reactivity, fructose is actually 7 to 11 times more glycating than glucose. But not only is fructose more glycating, you also can't test for it. A hemoglobin A1C test only tests for glycation from glucose. There is no way to test glycation from fructose. If you consume too much fruit for a long period of time, as more and more of the sugar enters your system, what happens is the cells continue to block it out, because like I said, if there is too much glucose in a cell, it is very toxic to it, and they become damaged. So then your blood sugar stays elevated. This right here is what is known as insulin resistance. But in reality, it's just that your cells, they can't take in any more of this glucose, or they'll become damaged. So they lock it out, and therefore it stays in your blood. Now over time, if your blood sugar continues to stay elevated, and it gets higher and higher, this leads to a disease. You've probably heard of it. It's called type 2 diabetes. It's not very pleasant. I'm no doctor, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Because your blood sugar's high at all times, you have lots of glycation going on, eventually it can lead to like limbs getting cut off and stuff. Certainly not something that you want to be dealing with. But there's also another issue with the way fruit's broken down. Fructose is metabolized very differently. It goes straight to the liver to be metabolized rather than straight to the bloodstream. In the liver, it's broken down into different things. One of these is fats. So if you consume a lot of fruit and therefore fructose, you can get a buildup of fat in your liver. This is what is known as fatty liver. As the name suggests, fatty liver is just fat accumulation in your liver. The bloke who came up with the name definitely wasn't feeling too creative on the day, although I am kind of glad he did it this way. There are a lot of dorks out there who discover something and they give it some fancy name. Anyways, what was I saying? So, fructose stored in the liver. Too much fat in the liver over a long enough period of time can cause liver damage. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's going to have liver damage and get diabetes from having fruit. You know, if you're a fit and healthy individual, you can probably consume quite a bit of fruit for a while before you even start to show signs of developing these things. But if you consume fruit for extended periods of time, these things can definitely become a problem. Now, what you'll see online is a bunch of people talking about how fruit reduces inflammation markers and that there are studies to prove it. The thing with these studies is they're poorly designed. They'll compare fruit juice with another beverage that mimics the macronutrients in the fruit juice. So essentially, they're giving them some sort of sugar syrup. And then what they find is that the people drinking the fruit juice, they have the improved inflammation markers. The claim from these studies is that fruit juice shows anti-inflammatory properties, when in reality, the only claim you can make from that study is that consuming fruit juice is less inflammatory than drinking some random sugar syrup. Anyways, one last problem with fruit. This one might be the worst thing. I might have said that about another point, but this time I actually mean it. Anyway, so if you were to go outside, grow some fruit, you'd have a serious problem. The birds, the insects, they would maul that thing before you even got to look at it. Us humans, we got too good at the old crossbreeding, we've made it too tasty. Now every animal from the animal kingdom wants our fruit. So what we do is we try to kill these animals. Now, there ain't no vegans out here protesting about this. As the great Nietzsche once said, if you crush a cockroach, you're a hero. But if you kill a butterfly, you're a villain. Morals have aesthetic criteria. But anyway, how we try to kill these animals is we spray some compounds on it. Now, keep in mind, these compounds are specifically designed to kill insects that try to eat our fruit. Now, I'll put up on screen right now the ingredients of the most commonly used pesticides, and you can tell me if any of these lab-made pesticides sound very healthy to you. Now, a lot of people get pretty clever. They think they can outsmart the system. They use their tap to, wash off all the pesticides, and then they buy organic. These pesticides are literally designed to withstand torrential rain. So even when it's hailing, bucketing, probably snowing, this stuff doesn't come off. Do you really think your tap's going to do anything? And then for the people that buy organic, organic is a marketing term. One of the greatest marketing terms of all time, by the way. What organic means is natural pesticides. What does natural even mean? Technically speaking, at some point or another, everything's natural. It's such a grey area. A lot of these organic pesticides are full of seed oils, which again, don't wash off. So yeah, pesticides, big problem. If you're on carnivore, you're not feeling amazing, you want to add fruit, there's a couple things you can do. First, add more fat. Fat's our fuel source. A lot of people, they think they're eating a lot of fat, when in reality, they're not. Most people ate zero fat before they went on carnivore, so they'll add like a little bit in, and all of a sudden they're high-fat carnivores. You need more fat, or you need more salt. A carnivore diet is a low-carbohydrate diet. When you first enter a low-carbohydrate state, you retain a lot less electrolytes. Because salt is made up of two electrolytes, sodium and chlorine, you retain a lot less of this stuff, and in particular with sodium, a lot of people don't retain enough of it, and therefore their fluid balance is all messed up, so you don't have incredible amounts of energy. So more fat, more salt. Over time, you'll become more and more fat adapted. You're just going to feel better and better. It really does suck that fruit has all these problems because it sure does taste good, but you will be a lot better off without it. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. See you next time.